The city of Hue was not supposed to become a battlefield. It was the ancient imperial capital of Vietnam, a place of pagodas, university students, families, and ceremonial gardens. For centuries, it had been associated with tranquility and scholarship, a city of quiet dignity resting along the Perfume River. Even during the early years of the war, Hue remained relatively untouched, a cultural sanctuary insulated from the worst of the conflict. At least that was the illusion. When the Tet Offensive erupted in late January 1968, the illusion shattered with the force of a hammer. Across South Vietnam, coordinated attacks struck more than 100 cities, bases, and towns. But nowhere did the offensive take on greater symbolic meaning than Hue, the city whose very existence spoke to the heritage of Vietnam itself. The documentary narrator begins. The battle for Hue would become the longest and bloodiest urban fight of the Vietnam War. What began as a surprise attack turned into a brutal, house-to-house struggle fought inch by inch, room by room, over nearly a month. For the Marines, soldiers, and ARVN forces who battled there, it was unlike anything they had faced before. Before dawn on January 31, 1968, Communist forces disguised as civilians slipped into the city in small teams, blending seamlessly with the crowds preparing for the Tet holiday. They carried weapons hidden in funeral coffins, produce carts, and wicker baskets. They moved with purpose, but without urgency, positioning themselves near key buildings, intersections, and communication nodes. When the time came, they would strike all at once. And at 3:40 a.m., the first explosion shattered the night. North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong fighters surged through the streets, overwhelming police stations, government buildings, and military outposts before most defenders even realized the city was under attack. Red and gold communist flags were raised above buildings that had been under South Vietnamese control minutes earlier. American advisors inside the MACV compound, one of the few strongpoints on the south side of the river, were jolted from sleep by gunfire that sounded impossibly close. The compound, manned by Marines and American personnel, suddenly found itself isolated, surrounded, and cut off from reinforcements. Heavy machine gun fire raked the walls and mortars began landing in the courtyard. The narrator adds, "For the first 12 hours of the battle, the Marines inside the compound fought alone. They had no sense of how widespread the attack was and no clear understanding of the enemy's strength. In the early confusion of Tet, Hue looked less like a battlefield and more like a city being swallowed by shock." Across the Perfume River, on the north side, the citadel, the old walled imperial fortress, was almost entirely overrun. Within minutes, thousands of NVA troops had secured the main gates and flooded into its ancient courtyards. Families fled into basements, pulling shutters closed, praying that the violence would pass. It would not. By sunrise, communist forces controlled most of the city. Far south of Hue, at Phu Bai Marine Base, radio communications crackled with fragmented reports that seemed too chaotic to be accurate. Units were missing. ARVN positions were no longer responding. Convoys attempting to approach Hue were receiving fire from multiple directions. Colonel Stanley Hughes, commanding Marines in the area, understood immediately that this was no small raid. "We're going in," he told his staff. "Hue is in danger of falling entirely." The 1st Battalion, 1st Marines received orders to move. They loaded onto trucks and amphibious tractors under a gray sky, rain beginning to fall in the steady monsoon rhythm that would plague every operation in the coming days. Marines tightened their helmet straps, checked ammo, pulled ponchos tight. For some, this was their first major operation. For others, Hue would become the most intense fighting of their entire tour. As the convoy rolled north toward the city, they passed burning villages, shattered houses, and confused clusters of civilians fleeing along the roadside. The air was thick with smoke and soaked with humidity. A Marine private at the back of the column whispered to another, "Doesn't look like Tet to me." His friend replied, "Looks like hell warmed up." The closer they got to the city, the more incoming fire they received. Snipers fired from tree lines. RPGs arced from concealed positions. The Marines dismounted, forming skirmish lines. The progress was slow, brutal, and unpredictable. Then, through the mist and smoke, the first glimpses of the city appeared: rooftops, temples, and the massive, ancient walls of the citadel rising like a grim monument above the chaos. Hue had become a fortress occupied by an enemy who intended to hold it at all costs. When the Marines reached the outskirts, they were met by a scene that none of them would forget. Bodies lay in the street. Homes smoldered. Families crouched behind piles of rubble, their faces reflecting pure terror. The Perfume River, usually a calm ribbon through the city, was choked with debris and drifting smoke. The Marines advanced toward the McVie compound, where beleaguered Americans had been fighting for more than 24 hours without relief. Gunfire echoed through the narrow streets. The sound bounced off stone walls, creating a disorienting chorus that made it nearly impossible to identify where shots were coming from. Urban combat had begun. The narrator continues. The Marines were trained for jungle fighting, for ambushes, patrols, and open field engagements. But Hue was something new. Every window could hide a sniper. Every doorway could be booby-trapped. Every alleyway was a channel of death. A Marine squad made their way down a street lined with shuttered shops and abandoned bicycles. Rain pattered on metal roofs, forming thin streams that trickled into gutters filled with spent casings. The squad leader signaled to halt, movement ahead. An NVA soldier darted across the street, rifle raised. The Marines opened fire, bullets sparking against stone. The enemy soldier vanished behind a barricaded doorway. "They're dug in deep," one Marine muttered, "house to house." And so it began. The slow, difficult process of clearing each building, each room, each rooftop. Grenades first, then entry, short bursts of fire, then silence, then movement, then more fire. Progress measured not in blocks, but in feet. By late afternoon, the Marines reached the McVie compound. When the gates opened, exhausted American advisors spilled out wearing torn uniforms, blackened with soot, eyes hollow from the siege. Relief washed over them, but the battle was far from over. The narrator. The Marines now controlled the south side of the river, but across the Perfume River lay the citadel, where thousands of enemy troops were entrenched behind walls 3 meters thick. To liberate Hue, both sides of the river had to be taken. The rain intensified. The sky darkened. The Marines dug in for the night. The city burned. And in the citadel, the NVA prepared for the coming storm.
The night after the Marines relieved the McVie compound was one of the most tense in the entire battle. Rain hammered the tin roofs, pooling in streets already choked with shattered bricks, broken furniture, and collapsed masonry. The stench of smoke mixed with the earthy scent of wet soil, filling the air with a heaviness that made even breathing feel deliberate. Inside the compound, Marines reloaded magazines, dried socks over small burners, and tried to make sense of what they had walked into. The city was still crawling with enemy troops. Entire platoons of NVA infantry had dug themselves into positions around temples, schools, government buildings, and residential blocks. They had firing lanes mapped out. They had pre-sighted machine gun nests. They had supplies stored in basements and tunnels. They had every advantage. The documentary narrator explains, Hue was not a city the Marines could simply rush. It had become a labyrinth, an urban maze where every doorway hid danger, Every rooftop was a potential sniper hide, and every courtyard could conceal an ambush. But there was no turning back. The southern half of the city had to be cleared block by block. And beyond that, looming like a massive stone leviathan across the Perfume River, was the Citadel, the imperial fortress that the NVA had transformed into a fortified redoubt. Before dawn, the Marines launched their first push deeper into the southern districts. The rain had lightened to a mist, blurring the edges of the city into a gray haze. Platoons moved cautiously through narrow streets, hugging walls, stepping over debris. The sound of distant gunfire echoed like muffled thunder. Then, without warning, the quiet broke. An explosion erupted at the front of the column, a command-detonated mine. Shrapnel tore through the air, sending Marines diving behind rubble. Automatic fire followed immediately, rattling down the street like a steel rain. The enemy was waiting. A squad of NVA troops had barricaded themselves inside a former schoolhouse. They fired from windows that had been smashed into jagged openings, giving them perfect sightlines onto the street. The Marines responded with everything they had: M16s, grenades, M79 grenade launchers. But the school's concrete walls absorbed the punishment with barely a crack. Urban combat demanded a different rhythm. It was slower, more methodical, more intimate. The Marines pulled back and regrouped. A tank, an M48 Patton, rumbled forward, its treads grinding over rubble. The 90mm gun fired into the building, shaking the earth. Dust billowed out of every opening like smoke from a collapsing furnace. The Marines advanced again, entering the building by force. Inside, visibility was low. Dust choked the air. The corridors were narrow. Rooms were filled with overturned desks. Voices echoed strangely, distorted by the concrete. 3 NVA soldiers were still alive. The confrontation was brief, violent, and decisive. When the building was finally secured, the Marines pushed onward. By midday, the southern districts had become a patchwork of contested blocks. Marines fought through storefronts, pharmacies, tailor shops, and family homes. They kicked down wooden doors swollen from moisture. They crawled along rooftops slick with rain. They fought in rooms decorated with framed family photos, now lying in shards on the ground. The Marines quickly learned that taking a building didn't mean holding it. The enemy used tunnels, back alleys, and hidden courtyards to reappear behind them, forcing the Marines to remain constantly alert, constantly tense, constantly aware that danger was no more than a few feet away. The narrator's voice cuts in. Urban combat in Hue was unlike anything in the Vietnam War. Marines measured progress in meters, not miles. Every block was a battle. Every day was an eternity. That afternoon, the Marines pushed toward the Treasury Building, a massive structure that dominated its block and offered commanding fields of fire. As they approached, enemy snipers opened up from its upper floors, pinning the Marines behind a stone wall. Tank rounds hammered the building, but the snipers kept firing. A Marine lieutenant, crouched behind a heap of broken bricks, muttered, "We're not getting that thing by force alone. We need to get closer." A squad crawled through a flooded alley, water rising past their ankles, then their knees. They moved under fire, holding rifles above their heads. When they emerged on the other side, an RPG slammed into the alley entrance behind them, sending water and debris spraying across their backs. The Marines stormed the side of the building, breaching a door that splintered with a wet crack. Inside, they cleared rooms methodically, grenades first, then entry teams. For every room taken, 2 more waited. By the time they secured the building, several Marines had been hit. The snipers were eliminated. The treasury was theirs. But Hue was far from liberated. As the sun went down, the Marines dug into defensive positions for another long night. The city flickered with fires. Distant explosions rumbled like summer storms. Radio operators scribbled sit-raps under poncho covers, shielding equipment from the misting rain. And across the river, the citadel glowed faintly in the haze, an ancient fortress preparing to become a battlefield.
If the southern half of Hue was a maze, the northern half, the citadel, was a fortress born from centuries of warcraft. Its walls were massive, its gates fortified, and its interior divided into districts, courtyards, moats, inner walls, and the Imperial Palace complex. And now, thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers occupied it. Before dawn on February 2nd, the Marines received their orders:
Cross the Perfume River, secure a foothold in the citadel, begin clearing the northern half of the city, one street, one block, one courtyard at a time. The task was monumental. The weather was miserable. The enemy was ready. The Marines boarded small landing craft and motorized boats. The Perfume River, usually a gentle reflection of the sky, had turned into a dark, churning obstacle filled with debris. Machine gun fire erupted from the far bank, cutting across the water in glowing arcs. Bullets snapped overhead. Boats rocked violently as rounds punched into their hulls. The Marines returned fire, sending tracers zipping across the river like burning needles. When the boats reached the far bank, the Marines leapt out into knee-deep muck, pushing forward under fire. Some hugged the wall of the citadel. Others dashed across open ground that offered no cover. Mortar rounds landed in towering plumes of mud and water. The narrator explains, "Crossing the Perfume River was not a landing. It was a gauntlet." The Marines entered the citadel under withering fire, knowing that the enemy held every advantage: high ground, heavy weapons, and fortified positions. Once inside the walls, the Marines found themselves in another world, a world of moss-covered stone, ancient gates, ornate gardens turned to rubble, and courtyards churned into mud by artillery. The first major objective was the Taylock airfield. Though small, it offered a key logistical advantage, and the NVA knew it. Machine gun nests covered its approaches. Snipers occupied the ruins of nearby buildings. The Marines fought toward the airfield with grinding determination. Tanks moved forward, their engines growling. Infantry leapfrogged along walls, using small holes blasted in masonry to pass between courtyards. Every block brought new casualties. At one point, a squad advanced down a narrow lane lined with stone. Halfway through, an NVA machine gun opened up from a concealed position at the far end. The Marines dropped flat as bullets tore chunks out of the walls above their heads. "Pinned!" someone shouted. A Marine corporal belly-crawled forward under fire, pulled the pin on a grenade, and hurled it into the machine gun nest. The explosion echoed through the lane. The firing stopped. They moved again. By midday, the Marines reached the edge of the airfield, only to be met with a storm of RPGs. One blast knocked 2 Marines off their feet, another hit a tank, disabling it. Smoke billowed across the runway. The rain turned the mud into a sucking mire that clung to boots and equipment. Still, the Marines pushed on. Clearing the airfield took hours. When it finally fell, the Marines were exhausted, soaked, and running low on ammunition. But they had gained a foothold in the citadel, and with it, momentum. The battle for Hue was turning. Yet the enemy had no intention of retreating. They fell back into the imperial quarters, fortifying the labyrinthine corridors around the imperial palace. There, they prepared to make their final stand. The narrator. Every step deeper into the citadel brought the Marines closer to the heart of the city and deeper into the enemy's most heavily fortified positions. Artillery thundered across the river. The citadel shook. Ancient stone cracked. Roof tiles flew into the air like shattered shells. And still the Marines advanced. Through courtyards, through ancestral halls, through gardens that had once been peaceful sanctuaries. Now, they were killing fields. The enemy counterattacked twice that night, trying desperately to push the Marines back to the river. Both times, the Marines held. Firefights raged in the dark, tracers bouncing off stone walls like angry sparks. The rain never stopped. Hue had become a city of ghosts. Broken buildings, shattered gates, and endless echoes of gunfire. And as dawn approached, the Marines prepared for the final push. By the middle of February, after weeks of brutal combat,
The Marines had clawed their way through the citadel, block by block, gate by gate, step by step. They had lost many men. They had taken enormous ground. But one objective remained: the imperial palace. It was the symbolic heart of Hue, and the NVA intended to make it their Alamo. The palace grounds were a maze of courtyards, reflecting pools, pavilions, and ornate structures. But now they were blasted ruins. The once beautiful architecture was shattered by artillery. The air was thick with dust. Splintered wood and chunks of ancient stone littered the walkways. The Marines prepared for the final assault. The narrator begins. The battle for the Imperial Palace was not just a tactical objective. It was a struggle for control of the city's soul. The Marines knew that taking it would break the enemy's grip on Hue, but they also knew the cost would be high.